we got caught in one river crossing, and then we saw another one coming up on the map, and so we wanted to try to avoid it.
Mm.
And so we saw this line on the map on our GPS that looked like it went parallel to the main road, and we figured, okay, it looks like maybe we could go that way and sort of avoid the river crossing and meet up with the main road a little bit later on. And so we ended up, to make a long story short, at both of our cars at the bottom of this like really rocky ravine, like this canyon in the absolute middle of nowhere. No one around for miles and miles. We were totally stranded there. Our cars just could not make it up either back the way we came or up the other side. There was all these rocks. Thankfully, we had these satellite devices. We ended up sending a text by satellite to a friend back in the UK, who in turn reached out to the British and American embassies in Ulaanbaatar, or the capital on the other side of the country.
Welcome to the Winging It Travel podcast with me, James Hammond. Every Monday, I'll be joined by guests to talk about their travel stories, travel tips, backpacking advice, and so much more. Right now, I'm taking the podcast on the road travelling with me. So tune in every week for short form episodes detailing all my travels alongside my Monday guest episode. Are you a backpacker, gap year student, or simply someone who loves to travel? Then this is the podcast for you, designed to inspire you to travel. There'll be stories to tell, tips to share, and experiences to inspire. Welcome to the show. Hello and welcome to this week's episode where I'm joined by Scott Gurian, who hosts the Far From Home podcast and is a journalist, audio producer and adventure traveller. I'm super keen to hear about Scott's journey from London to Mongolia on the Mongol Rally, which is about 11,000 miles. Scott went to Iran as an American tourist, which is super fascinating. I'm going to hear about that. Another interesting travel story is Scott visiting Chornobyl and the abandoned buildings around there. He's also featured in many publications and channels worldwide and has so much to chat about. Scott, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me on.
Tell the listeners right now, where are you based?
At the moment, I'm in my home in northern New Jersey, just outside of New York City, which is where I am when I'm not traveling. But I've just gotten back from some recent travels. I was in Copenhagen for a brief reporting trip, and then I went to Latvia for my first time in the Baltics.
Nice.
Interviewed someone there for another story, and I'm back here at home for a little bit until I hit the road again.
Is your work based at where you are now, or is that more about where you're from and you just like living there?
My work can be based anywhere. I bring my laptop and I have an internet connection.
Dream.
I mean, I have my own podcast that I make, and then I do some freelance producing and reporting for various other places, and it can be anywhere. It could be somewhere in the world where I find an interesting story, if it's like an actual story I'm reporting, or it can just be me working remotely producing one of the podcasts I work on, which I can do from anywhere in the world.
The dream scenario, I think. If you long to get internet, you're sorted, right?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
my hope. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What's your thoughts on this? Is a random question I was thought of. Let's say pre-COVID, right? If you're looking to work remotely, you probably have to get a work visa, right? Because I don't think working remotely was a popular thing. But now we've got so many people who have realized, oh, do you know what? If I just have my laptop and an internet connection, I can literally go anywhere in the world to work. But what is the situation with the visas, you think? Because can you just go on a tourist visa in any country, within reason, that's easy, and just turn up for a month or two as a tourist, but you're working on your laptop? Or would you still want to get like a proper business or work visa to do your work in that country?
No, I don't see a need. I mean, for me personally, in my situation, there's all these countries now that are introducing digital nomad
Yeah.
visas and everything. But I mean, that's if you really want to stay there for, I don't know, 6 months, a year, a few
Mm.
years, and for me, I, I just want to keep traveling. Like I am definitely, and we could get into this later. I'm definitely a fan of slow traveling, and I like spending
Yes.
like a month, 2 months, 3 months in a place. More than 6 months seems like a really long time for me. And I want to just keep finding stories from different places, experiencing different cultures. And so I don't really see a need personally for visas like that. Of course, again, it depends on the country, which, if I go to Mexico as an American, I could go there for 6 months on a tourist
Mm.
visa. In Europe and the Schengen area, I can go for 3 months, 90 days within a 180-day period.
Yeah.
That's generally enough time to satisfy my wanderlust in a particular country or region. So I don't personally see a need for these extended digital nomad visas in my situation. There may be some countries where if they have, normally I would only be able to go for a very short time. Maybe I would
Hmm.
look into that. But in general, I don't really see a need for that.
Yeah, I'm trying to work out what the advantage of getting a digital nomad visa. So, for example, Japan, right? They bought a new one out in March, but the criteria is you have to earn like $68,000 or something a year, which is for a digital nomad quite a lot of money, right? So I'm trying to work out, well, why wouldn't you just go there on a tourist visa and just work on your laptop? I cannot get my head around what the advantage is. Maybe, like you say, you want to say long term.
Yeah, I think it's all about how long you want to stay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I'd like to delve back into sort of travel history, if you like. So, where did you initially grow up, and was there any hint of travel when growing up that maybe ignited your interest in it?
So I grew up where I am right now in New Jersey, and we did some traveling growing up. My brother and I were raised by our mom. Our parents were divorced, and we would. I mean, I think our mother was always very naturally curious about things and about the world, and she instilled that in us from a very young age. She was an only child, and I think her parents were a little bit overly protective of her, so she kind of gave us free reign to go. She trusted us to go off on our own. We would go up on ski trips up to Vermont, and even at a young age, she would have us reading, back when we used paper maps, navigating how to get there to learn how to do that. My brother once, when he was, I don't know how old he was, maybe 12 years old or something, and she let him fly across the country by himself to go to ski camp or somewhere in, like, I think British Columbia or somewhere. Like
Oh
most
wow!
parents would not let a kid that age go on an airplane across the country by themselves. So she very much let us do that and was always cheering us on. And she took us. We went scuba diving and snorkeling around the Caribbean. So I've been to a bunch of places there. We didn't go on a lot of other big international trips, like to other places outside of the Caribbean. That kind of came for me later on. But just instilling that curiosity about the world and just interest in other cultures and other places. I think that was very formative for me. And as I've gotten older, I think that's grown more and more.
So you had it early on then, like that interest because you're doing quite a lot of trips. That's quite interesting. Yeah.
I think so. And geography was always my favorite subject in
Same.
school,
Same.
just
Yeah.
studying
Love
maps. And I don't know
maps.
what it
Yeah.
is. Just learning about these, obscure countries. I did in like middle school, we had to choose like an African country or something to do something on. And of course, I chose what was then called Swaziland and Lesotho, the
Oh
most
yeah. Yeah.
obscure
Yeah.
countries, and I like cooked a dish from, Swaziland and like studied so I'm always interested in the weird obscurities, peculiarities of maps and different places. And that's carried forward, I think, into my reporting, where I'm interested in hearing stories from parts of the world that people never hear from, and like, what is it
Mm.
like? What's going on there? And maybe this country is rarely mentioned in the news. Maybe people have never even heard of it before. But I'm curious that like people live there. It's another distinct culture and language and everything, and like I want to find out more about it.
Yeah, how good are maps? Like underrated. I know it's quite a niche subject, but I used to love maps and just reading the population, the capital city, what language do they speak. Sort of early doors kind of ignited my interest in geography, I suppose, and then eventually travel. But the options are endless, something because that, like you say, there's a minuscule part of the world where that is a different culture in itself within the same country. So the options are endless to go and explore and learn about something new.
Right, right. No, I love maps. Paper maps, even digital maps. Anything's better than using GPS, because
Yeah,
people
yeah,
just,
yeah.
it's like tunnel vision. They know how to, they just follow the directions to go from one place to the next, but they don't even understand where they are. They don't understand the bigger context. And then the GPS stops working, and then they're totally confused and lost. Like, I think it's important to kind of just have a sense of the world around you.
Totally agree because we bought a paper map for our US road trip last year. Never used it,
Mm, yeah.
but I just love reading it and just can't get rid of it.
Sure. No, it's sometimes it's nice to have. And certain
Yeah.
places, like when I was driving across Central Asia and Mongolia, like some of these places are so remote, like
Mm.
GPS just doesn't work very well. Like I mean, first of all, there's not a lot of, good cell signal. But then also a lot of these places just haven't been mapped out very well. So we had like, in addition to GPS, we had like 3 different paper maps. So we were constantly comparing, maybe one doesn't show this road, another one what does. So there are certain parts of the world where paper maps are still definitely helpful.
And these massive countries like, Canada, Australia, USA is quite well mapped, but like, Russia to an extent as well. Mongolia is another one. These countries just still got years and years to come of road building, right? So they haven't been mapped because
Yes.
there's actually no roads.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
quite hard to think. You think nowadays, like, oh, there's loads of roads that we've done the hard graft, but actually there must be loads more coming.
Go to
Yeah,
Mongolia and you'll see. And it may be, it was 2016 when I was there. I think they've built more roads since I was there.
yeah.
But when I was there, I mean, it's an enormous country, and you look at a map of Mongolia and you'll see, 2 lines going east and west, one in the north, one in the south, and you figure, okay, these are the main east-west roads across the
Mhm.
country. And okay, maybe they're not highways, but at least they're paved. But no, we show up and it's just like tracks through the sand and grass for much of the way. And these are the main east-west roads across the country. It's crazy.
That's crazy. Mental. Okay. And then growing up, did you start to think, well, okay, I need to do something job wise that's going to enable some travel? Or was it purely separated at that point where you're just looking to get a career under the go?
I think that came a little bit later on. So I became more interested in travel. And it came kind of late for me because it's interesting. Like even like in high school, like there was an opportunity to do like go on an exchange program to
Mm,
Mexico. And my mom had to like twist my arm to like, oh, I think it would be good for you. And I'm so glad she did. Like that was a great experience for me at a
mm,
young age to do that. And even in college, like I had the opportunity to study abroad. Like my college actually had a abroad, like a small campus in a castle in the Netherlands. I could have gone there for a semester and like why? I don't know. The thought just didn't occur to me. I'm like kicking myself now.
yeah.
So yeah, for a while I just didn't have that wanderlust so much. So that came a little bit later on. I think what really started it was during my forget whether it was my junior year or my senior year of college. During spring break. A lot of people go to Mexico for spring
Yeah.
break. They go to like Cancun or whatever. For me, I went to Mexico during my spring break, but I spent the week following an indigenous rebel tribe going to this was I want to say 99 or 2000, I believe. This is the Zapatistas. If anyone remembers old Rage Against the Machine videos, like the people, the balaclavas, where
Yeah.
it's this indigenous rebel group that they were having at this point. They were all teaming up with other indigenous groups around the country of Mexico. They were planning this week or a few week long caravan that was going across Mexico, eventually descending upon the Zocalo in Mexico City to press for indigenous demands, rights from the government. And so it just happened to line up part of it, I think the final week of it with my spring break from school. And I knew some filmmakers who were making a documentary about them. And so I flew down to Mexico. This crazy story. Just I had the barest of this is before we had smartphones or
Mm,
anything. So I just had the barest, schedule of where the Zapatistas were going to be and what part of Mexico each day. This happened to line up perfectly with my spring break. And so I flew down to Mexico City and I just like took a bus to another state in Mexico where I saw the Zapatistas were going to be there. And then from there, I took a bus to another state, and I had very bad Spanish at the time. It's still not great, but it was even worse then. And just going to smaller and smaller towns, like asking people, do you know where the Zapatistas are? And finally managed to find them in this little like shanty town in the middle of nowhere. Found my filmmaker friends, and they said, how in the world did you ever find us?
yeah.
And I spent that week following them around, like on this yellow school bus, like they're going all around the country of Mexico from city to city. I got pickpocketed. At the end of I rented a cell phone from the airport, and I was like doing radio reporting, and like several times like live across the country in the US, like doing like national live reports as this young 20-year-old kid or whatever. And returned the cell phone to the airport at the end of the week and got like a $2,000 bill. And I was just so far over my head, had no idea what I was doing, but it was just amazing. And then at the end, after the week, like all these, I remember being in the Zocalo in Mexico City at like 6 in the morning or whatever, is just a few people walking around selling tamales or whatever, and just, doing this live report from there, and just knowing, okay, like I'm part of this historic thing. A few hours later, there were like 300,000 people in the square,
Wow.
and like just covering this whole thing. It was just the most incredible experience I've ever had, or at the time at least. And that just made me think, this is amazing. I want to do more of this kind of thing. And I've started out in like radio journalism, and I just realized that the coolest, most fascinating experiences I had were when I was abroad. And so I want to do more, like I want to do like the foreign correspondent thing. I want to do more international
Mm.
reporting. And so that kind of combined my interest in journalism and radio with my interest in traveling, and that's what I've been doing ever since.
God, what a great experience early doors. That's unreal. What makes me laugh is you probably went back to college and like you probably got some friends that went, yeah, I went to Cancun and
Exactly.
party out for a week, and then like, "Oh, what would you do then?" Like, where do
Exactly.
you start
Yeah.
with that story?
Yeah, people just don't get it.
Yeah.
It was just such a cool experience. In some ways kind of life-changing for me at that time. And ever since then I've wanted to do what I've been doing.
So I assume that you finished your course, came qualified in brackets, I suppose, and then went out into the world reporting.
Yeah, I graduated college, did some started doing some freelance reporting, worked in DC for a year, got randomly hired as a news director at a small public radio station near Oklahoma City for like 5 years. Just kind of jumped around, went back to school for like a semester, took this intensive program in radio documentary production. And but then and also worked in New York for a while, reported after Superstorm Sandy. It hit
Mm.
my part of the country, New Jersey, and so I did like investigative reporting for like a couple of years, following the whole rebuilding process. But eventually, the travel, the wanderlust, kind of caught up with me, and I realized I really don't. I'm not so interested in doing domestic reporting anymore. Like I really want to go abroad, want to kind of pursue these international stories, and that's mainly been my focus ever since.
Okay. And what maybe is some tips for someone listening right now who maybe wants to get into what you're doing? Like, is it just about being brave, taking opportunities, doing some freelance stuff, offering your services, that sort of stuff?
Um, I mean, it helps that I already had the experience in the background,
Mm.
like knowing how to make good radio stories before I ever kind of went abroad.
Yeah.
So I kind of, I learned, by working at several radio stations around the US, and by studying radio documentary, and working under editors who could give me feedback and say, because I always thought I was better than I was, but I realized after a while I really had a lot to learn. Like when I listen back to some of my early stuff now, it really makes me cringe.
Same for
So
anyone. Yeah.
yeah. So I feel like having all of that under my belt, like having that experience, made me much better prepared for when I decided to go off on my own to then go abroad. That I felt more confident in my skills. I knew how to make a good story. I had all the gear I needed. So yeah, I feel like that's prepared me well for what I've decided to do.
And how did you navigate getting international stories out there to publications or news corporations, whatever? But how did you? Is it pitching a story, or is it yourself going to do a story then pitching that story? How did that work?
Works various different ways. I mean, I have my own podcast I've started, Far From
Mm.
Home, where I'll just find interesting stories that interest me and just do them for my own show. I'm not getting paid for my shows, so sometimes I
Tell me
like to
about
also
it.
look for, sometimes I'll find an interesting story and I'll pitch to somewhere else, and so it'll air on their show, and they'll also let me air it on my own show, and that
Cool.
also gives me good exposure for my program, and they'll pay me well.
Hmm.
Yeah, I've done a few stories that sometimes they coincide with the trips I'm taking. Like I was planning on going to a radio conference in Ireland, and while I was there, I went up to Belfast and I pitched a story about the peace walls in Northern Ireland.
Hmm.
And so that was a whole documentary I made for this podcast, 99% Invisible.
Oh, great
I
podcast. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm actually working on another story for them right now in
Oh,
Copenhagen.
nice. I met someone
Um,
who done a story for them last year, I think.
oh, really?
Yeah.
Very cool. Very
I
cool.
think it's like Iowa's women's basketball team, something like that.
I think I heard that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an
Okay.
interesting, quirky one. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. But and then I've done a few stories for Planet Money, NPR's economic podcast.
Hmm.
Did a story. This is in this case was just a story I researched and thought was interesting. I'm always curious in stories. Like I said, partially stories from parts of the world you never hear about, but
Yeah.
also like there's sometimes like a certain area of the world will like totally be in the news, or at least the way that news cycles work. Everyone's focused on something, and then people move on to the next thing,
Yeah.
and then I'm curious, like maybe a year or two later, like wait, whatever happened to that, that
Oh,
place and
yeah.
those people.
Mm.
So there was this huge hurricane that hit the Caribbean a number of years ago and basically decimated the island of Barbuda in the country of Antigua and Barbuda. And I was curious, like a year or two later, like, okay, whatever happened to that? And so I did some research, and that turned into a story I did for Planet Money, where myself and my colleague Sarah, who works with the show, flew down there. We actually got to interview the prime minister, which was cool.
Oh, wow.
And just it's this whole like land dispute about rebuilding the island, and the government doesn't have the money, so they're trying to like bring in more tourist dollars, and Robert De Niro wants to build a resort there, and but the people who live there are afraid that we'll lose this kind of pristine,
Sure. Yeah.
these untouched beaches. It'll become
Mm.
a tourist paradise just like pretty much every other island in the Caribbean, and we like it more as a locals island. So there's stories like that I just find that I'm curious about, that this would be a good match for this particular show. I know the kinds of stories they're looking for, so it's a variety of different ways I go about it.
Yeah. And because travel is so widely reported on, talked about now, and social media as well, there's still options, I think, plenty of options in different countries where the lesser known places or stories or people can be reported on or talked about, right? Because we all know the popular places in each country, really, but there's still loads more that goes back to the map. Get a map right now, one country, one little area, and you probably think, oh, what's going on there? Like, is anything that's interesting to talk about, right? The options are, I think, endless. Yeah.
Yeah, and what I tend to look for are not typical like travel tourism kinds of things, but
Mm,
more like local, like stories under the radar kinds of
yeah.
things. Maybe they're things that all the locals are talking about, but like we in the West don't really hear
Yep.
much about.
Mm,
And like I'm a big fan of slow travel, like spending a lot of time in a place to really kind of get to go below the surface and find out about what are the local things people are concerned about, what are the they discussing, to really kind of look for these kind of important stories that are beyond just like, I mean, lots of travelers, tourists visit places, but they don't know anything about like the politics or the issues of that place. They just go
yeah.
to a beach or somewhere, but this country or this city or whatever still has a government. There's still issues that are affecting people when they go to vote for someone. There's things they're concerned about, challenges they're facing, and those are the kinds of things that I'm interested in.
Oh, that's great. Let's talk about slow travel before we get into some of your stories. What is slow travel to you?
So for me, just going to a place for like a week or two generally isn't enough. Like I like spending weeks on end, even months on end, to really get to know a place well. For example, a few years ago, I went to Lima, Peru, and I decided, I was there for like 4 weeks, and I figured I just want to stay in Lima. Like I
Yeah.
still haven't been to Machu Picchu or traveled that much around Peru. I figured, okay, that'll be a separate trip. I'd rather like divide it into a separate trip. I'm not a big fan of these whirlwind tours people do, trying to hit up a bunch of European countries or something in a few days. And it's funny when you travel, like that's kind of the joke. Like people meet an American and they're like, "Oh yeah, you're on this like weekend trip to Europe or whatever,"
Yeah.
because Americans they get so little vacation time from work
True.
for the most part, and so they tend to take these really short vacations and try to hit up as many places as possible, which is the antithesis of kind of my style. I like going much slower. There's so many places I want to see, but again, like okay, I'll make that a separate trip. I just want to focus on
Mm,
this one place. So going to Peru, I figured, okay, I'm going to be there for like a month. I'm just going to focus on Lima and get to know this one city really well. And by doing that, I got to meet so many people, I came back from that trip with so many stories and forging these relationships. It's often hard to find the kind of stories that I want. And it just involves just spending a lot of time in a place, talking to as many people as
mm,
possible, doing a
mm.
bunch of research. And for example, I did some research before I went, and I was looking on like Atlas Obscura or somewhere, and read about how in Lima there's this like witches and wizards market where they sell almost like voodoo kinds of things. and I was kind of curious, and okay, that could be like a spark of some kind of story idea. And I was talking to the guy who ran, the Airbnb where I was staying, and I told him about this. I was interested in it, and he said, "Oh, you should meet my friend Lucho. He's uh, like a shaman, but they don't use that word. He called himself a curandero, like a cure or a natural healer." He
Yeah.
said, "You should meet Lucho. He's into that kind of thing." So Lucho lived in the jungle in Pucallpa, like on the other side of the mountains, like near the edge of the Amazon. And so Lucho took like an overnight bus trip to Lima to meet me, and together we went. I joined him on this other like overnight bus trip up the coast to the city of Chiclayo, almost by the Ecuadorian border. It's not a place any tourists ever go. There's not a reason they would. And we went to this other like witches and wizards market to search for this star-shaped quartz stone that Lucho had seen in this hallucinogenic vision that was supposed to have magical healing powers. Like that's the kind of story you can't find if you show up somewhere for a week or so. Like you got to spend a lot of time in a
Yeah.
place. It was one of my favorite stories I've ever done. And that's why I love slow travel. Like just to uncover those kinds of things, you just need to spend a lot of time in a place.
What I really like about this conversation is last year when we done our year travel, we traveled too fast.
Mm,
And the biggest lesson I learned is a couple of lessons, but the biggest one, definitely in top three, is slow travel is the way forward because I
yeah,
don't want to be rushed, but I want to know more about the local customs, if you like.
right.
And that is a great thing to aspire to, but it's also quite difficult because it all depends on your job. How can you
Yes.
do it?
Not
Visas.
everyone could do it. I get that. Yes, totally.
But for me, it's one of my biggest aims, and I'm trying to plot out a path to do that in the future based on my travels from last year. But it has to be the best way forward. I can't see it any other way better traveling than that, unless you really are you just want to go and dip in for a week and that's enough for you. But for me, maybe that's not enough. Now being a bit older and a bit more wiser, I want to learn more about the culture and having a podcast like yours and mine as well. I think the future you've got to interview local people, right, and actually understand locally what's going on. Surely,
Right, right. And there's a lot of, I mean, I have a little bit of a beef with the whole community that wants to like travel to every country in the world. That not all of them, but some of them they're just like counting countries. They're just trying to go to as many places as possible. And for me, I just really want to make sure I understand and appreciate the culture and the place. And I'm not just checking another country off my list. Like if I could, I would love to visit every country in the world, but I want to do a story in every country in the world.
yeah,
Like I want to
yeah,
really have some insight into the culture and the place and the people. And more than just saying I've been there.
yeah. I think I'm guilty of that. Maybe wanting to be going to every country. I think that is still an aim, but I think I do agree with you that I don't think dipping in for 2 days is enough for me, really. Or at least I'd
Yeah,
have to go back again. I don't
yeah.
think I could, in especially the bigger countries. I mean, somewhere like I don't know, like China. I mean, if you go for a week, I mean, yeah. I mean, I technically I've been to Taiwan, so I could tick that off. But how many cultures are in China in different cities and different areas, right? As an example, right? But I think slow travel is definitely one for the future.
Yeah, I agree. Hmm.
But you did an interview on your podcast. I know we come to your podcast in a bit. Thor Peterson, right? Who traveled to every country in the world
Yes,
via not basically not flying. Took him
right.
7 8 years, right? So how was that when you're sort of interviewing him? Is his way of seeing every country different? Like, what was your thinking there?
I mean, he once he explained it to me. I mean, he spent what was it, like a decade or whatever it
Yeah,
was. Like, yeah. I mean, he said when he was first figuring it out, like what his rules were,
yeah,
and he thought if he spent like a month in every country in the world, how long that would take him, and it's probably not practical.
yeah.
And you probably don't need to spend a month in, well,
San
the
Marino.
Vatican, the Vatican, San Marino.
Yeah,
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 yeah, I get that. And it ended up taking him way longer than he had hoped for a
sure.
variety of things beyond his control, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah.
But I did get the sense speaking to him that he really did respect each place and each culture. Some other of these people, 193 people who are visiting and trying to visit every other
Mm.
country, I felt a little bit more conflicted with their approaches. People I've spoken to, but and who am I to judge? I mean,
Yeah,
everyone
yeah,
has their
yeah.
own
Of
style.
course.
It's just
Yeah.
they may travel in a way that wouldn't be for me. But personally, I just the way for me, because I'm a journalist, like reporting a story from each place is the way that I feel like I have that
Mm.
deeper insight. I understand most people aren't journalists, so they wouldn't go. Maybe they have their own ways, maybe of having some kind of meaningful experience or encountering the culture. But to each their own.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic, I think. the sort of topic of how many countries you've been to, which I do sometimes ask on my podcast because I'm interested. But I see some people do really want to tell you how many they've been to, but is that the true story? I'm not really sure.
Yeah. I try to even avoid those conversations. I mean, I know myself, but I don't put in my Instagram profile number of countries. For me,
Yeah,
it's not I don't see the point of like the contest.
the competition. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm.
Mm. Okay, let's go into a journey of yours, which I'm really interested because I had a couple of friends do it. I think must be 8, 10 years ago now, and it's the Mongol Rally. And I've
Mm.
not discussed that on my podcast to date, 3 years down the line. So can you explain to people what is the journey, what is it, and what's the aim?
Okay. Okay. So the Mongol Rally is an annual event. Actually, I don't think it's taken place in a few years now because there was COVID, and now with
Sure.
everything going on in Russia, it made it kind of difficult. But so presumably it'll go again at some point. I don't maybe they are doing it now in a modified version. I don't even know. I've been out of the loop. But anyway, when I did it, it was an annual event organized by this British outfit called the Adventurists, and they also have a number of other crazy journeys around the world, including the rickshaw run in India. You drive in this little
Oh yeah, the
rickshaw
rickshaw. I
across it.
saw that in India.
Yeah,
Yeah, I saw them
yeah,
drive by.
yeah.
Yeah.
They have one in Morocco where you ride these little monkey bikes, these little tiny motorcycles through the desert, all kinds of crazy things. The Mongol Rally is this drive across. There's usually a few hundred teams who do it every year, but it's not like a competition. There's really no winners or losers. You're just trying to get from the start to the finish line in kind of one piece and make it all the way because a lot of people don't make it all the way or they drop out or whatever. And so the start line when we did it was at the Goodwood racetrack in southern England. Now I think
Yeah.
in more recent years it's moved further east to the Czech Republic or somewhere. And so that's where it starts, and then it would end in originally it ended in Mongolia, but then just because of the restrictions with the cars, they moved it to Ulan-Ude, Siberia, which is just north of the
Oh,
Mongolian
okay.
border.
Yeah.
And it's very loosely organized. So there's a start line and the finish line, but along the way, you choose your own route, however you want to go. So, I mean, we took kind of the standard route, that many teams did, kind of southeast across Europe and then through Central Asia, up across Mongolia to the finish line. Some of the teams in past years have, put the car on a ferry and gone across part of North Africa, or even like up
Oh
through
wow.
Scandinavia, north of the Arctic Circle, just for the hell of it to say they did it and then came back down again. Just these ridiculous journeys. So yeah, you choose your own route along the way. And if you get into trouble, like there's no like hotline you could call of the adventurous saying, come rescue me. Like basically you're on your own. You figure it out yourself. And the other big rule is they make you take they actually limit the size of the engine of the car. Like they want you to take a little tiny car
Yeah.
that's kind of totally unsuitable for a journey of this sort. The thinking being that, if you have this crappy used, car, it'll probably be more likely to break down, and then you'll be forced to interact with the locals instead of just
Mm.
zooming through all these countries, which makes sense, in theory. But in our particular case, the car that my brother and I had, we had this little tiny Nissan Micra that broke down so many times. But we basically ended up broken down or in a garage in I think every country beginning in Bulgaria, I want to say, with the exception of Kyrgyzstan. So second or third time, okay, we broke down, another fun story to tell. By like the seventh or eighth time, we're like, oh my gosh, this is like a money pit. It's
Yeah.
like sucking up so much of our time that we could be having these cool adventures, meeting people, going to different places. And so that ended up being really kind of frustrating and annoying, which was unfortunate. Our friends, who we caravanned with, they had a very similar car to ours, and they just got lucky. They had hardly any issues at all with
Oh
their
wow.
car. So it's just kind of luck of the draw. So we got very unlucky, but we have lots of great stories to tell from that trip as a result.
It's interesting about the car, right? Because we have a quite an old car. It's like from the year 2000, right? Toyota Sienna.
Mm-hmm.
And you see all these newer cars drive about and they've got problems and left, right, and center. But somehow we managed to drive, I don't know, 23,000 kilometers on a road trip last year, and it
But
survived. No
but
problems.
where were these roads?
Yeah, exactly. I know the roads are a bit better.
Yeah, a bit is an understatement. Yeah, I mean, if you saw some of these once you get past, Eastern Europe, or actually the roads in Turkey are excellent, and Iran, they were okay. But once you get into the stands, especially like Tajikistan, the Pamir Highway, and some of these places, they're not just unpaved. I mean, there's these giant potholes you're dodging, and
Oh yeah,
it's
yeah.
really, really bad. Like, even just the suspension going over all these bumps. And then
Mm,
in Iran, there's all these like speed bumps. You'd be driving into town,
no
at a
sign.
fairly good clip. No, no, no
Yeah,
sign, nothing painted a different color. And
yeah.
suddenly you have this speed bump that's like 10 feet ahead of you, and you're going like 40 miles per hour, and you hit it and you go flying like Dukes of Hazzard, like up in the air. And yeah, we did that a few times. We're like, oh, this poor car, it came like crashing down. Like, oh my gosh.
We had that in Jordan last year. We
Oh yeah.
they have a load of speed bumps there, and the roads are pretty
Oh
decent in Jordan. But there
yeah.
was
Okay.
I must have been blindsided by a lorry or a truck as I was going past. I didn't see the sign. They usually have
Mm,
signs, but I missed it. And
okay.
then that last millisecond when you realize you're going
Yes.
40, 50 miles an hour, and
You
like,
just like
oh
clench, you
shit.
tense
Yeah,
up, and you're like,
yeah, you
oh
tense
no.
up. But you think, well, you can't brake because that might sort of start
Yeah.
the flow. So you have to like release it onto and hope you land okay. And
Yeah.
luckily, we're like, this is a higher car. Luckily, oh, I think it's okay. And we got away with it in the end. That split second before, bit scary.
It's
Five
an
minutes afterwards, right, let's stop and
adrenaline
see.
rush.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, nothing worse. But interesting story in the end. And yeah,
Yes.
I know Canada and USA roads are great. So I
Yes.
think my point was being that sometimes people can get really het up on how maybe modern the car is, and maybe it does help if you've got a huge SUV from year 2023. But
Yeah.
Japanese cars from 2000 still work as well, and there's a pretty good story about it. But yeah, the Mongol Rally, I know the potholes in like the Central Asia part can be
Mm.
pretty brutal.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
So on your road trip, you traveled about 11,000 miles.
Yeah, the particular route we chose
Yeah.
was about 11,000 miles. So we went like southeast across Europe, and across Turkey, Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan. It's kind of difficult to drive through China, apparently. So we went kind of around China, up
Mm.
through a little bit of Russia, and then across Mongolia, and then up, north back into Siberia to Ulan-Ude to the finish line. So that for us, that was about 11,000 miles, which I think is like 18,000 kilometers. And that took us about 7 weeks, 52 days.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there
Yeah.
were some of these roads, like I said, the Pamir Highway in Tajikistan. Like, we had like a satellite device in our car that was tracking our GPS and everything. And I think my brother calculated like some days, like the entire day, we were driving an average of like 20 miles per hour or something.
Yeah.
Like, it was so
Yeah.
slow just because it was just all unpaved. You're at the side of this like rocky cliff face, dodging potholes, and you've got Afghanistan right across the river, and you're like going really slow, and that's all we could do. Yeah, that's the only road there.
Yeah. Who had the worst roads?
I mean, the Pamir Highway that in Tajikistan definitely
Tajikistan.
was the
Yeah.
most. There was a one particularly bad stretch in Kazakhstan as well, just north of Almaty, where these potholes, we had been warned about it, but even so, it was pretty bad. I mean, it's all flat there. It's just on the steppe, but these potholes were just horrendous.
It's quite notorious for that, isn't it? I think it's quite like
Is it?
truckers are quite well known like around the world
Mm,
for like trying to dodge those potholes, right? And stuff. They're quite
okay, I
brutal,
didn't
aren't
know
they?
that. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm, mm.
Crikey. And then you stopped off in Iran. So
Mhm.
I guess my other question would be with the visa situation, how does it work? Are you entirely responsible for doing your own visas across the whole trip?
Yes. Yeah. Like I said, you have to do everything. There are companies you can hire, that can, if you pay them, they can help expedite,
Mm.
processing some of the visas. We ended up just doing it ourselves.
On the
Um,
road as you go?
no, 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 no.
No,
Beforehand,
before. Got it.
beforehand. Yeah. There's no way we could have, because they've got
Yeah.
to like ship off passports and send them back, and there's waiting times. So
Mm.
it would have been very difficult to do that on the road. So yeah, if you're an American, a Brit, or a Canadian, in order to go to Iran, you have to hire a tour guide. And first you have to get a letter of invitation, which just the tour company gives you, and then you
Mm.
actually have to have a guide take you through. And it's actually a tour guide. It's not like a government minder or
Yeah, yeah,
anything like that.
yeah.
It's, just a tour guide who took us around. So he met us at the border, and then went in one of our cars, and drove with us throughout the journey and showed us some sights. So that was in Iran. We figured, when are we ever going to be back in Iran, as American tourists? So we took our time. We slowed down a little bit there, did a bunch more kind of tourism, as opposed to much of the other Mongol Rally was just driving straight every day. But we did slow down in Iran. It was actually the perfect time. This was in 2016. So it's right after Obama had, and Iran had signed the nuclear agreement.
Yeah.
So, perfect time to be there as Americans. People were incredibly friendly, this sense of Persian hospitality, which I'm sure they'd still be that way even today. But just politically, it was easier for us to go then. And yeah, I think friendliest people I've met in all my travels anywhere in the world. You meet total strangers. They're so excited to meet Americans. They, to practice their English, they start chatting with you. Within 5 or 10 minutes, they're inviting you to come to their home, come for tea, come for dinner, stay with them, meet their families. Just incredibly warm and welcoming people.
Not the first time I've heard that on the podcast. People go to Iran. Yeah, 100%. I think it's quite key to spread that message, right? Because we obviously hear and see a lot of things on the news that maybe don't paint Iran in a nice picture.
Yeah, and there are legitimate concerns with the government and all of that, and but on a person-to-person level, people are incredibly warm and friendly, despite whatever political, geographic, or cultural differences they might have with Americans or Brits or Westerners. That on a person-to-person level, people are incredibly warm and friendly.
Could you speak Farsi?
No, I didn't speak any of the languages in any of these countries we went to. It would have been really helpful to know some Russian going through Central Asia.
Of course,
but, I learned about 3 or 4 words, but no, I definitely don't speak Farsi.
Fair enough, because I realized in the Middle East last year when I was traveling around that I didn't go to Iran, but I went to other countries that speak Arabic, basically. And if you know a bit of Arabic, they really, and Turkey as well, if you learn a bit of Turkish, they really take kindly to you giving a bit of an effort to try and learn how are you in their own language, which is probably the case for a lot of countries around the world. But Middle East have got this amazing sense of hospitality, like you mentioned, where they do want to invite you in or make sure you're okay. And I remember that, we were at a bus station in Ankara, and Ankara is not actually as westernized as you think, and it's quite conservative there. But at the bus station, it's not quite clear about what bus is going to. We were going to Göreme to go to Cappadocia, and we had 3 people just making sure we got on the bus. Like, oh, this is the bus. Like, you need to go here. 3 different people realized that we're like standing out as foreigners, looking to go somewhere, and just making sure you get on that bus. So I think a lot of hospitality that I experienced last year was quite eye-opening, actually, especially during Ramadan as well. Yeah. For Iran, did you go to any of the classic tourist things that you can do there, like Persepolis or?
Yeah, we entered from Turkey in the west. We stopped in Tabriz, spent a couple nights in Tehran. Went down to Esfahan, which is amazing. And people seen pictures of the big central square there, the plaza. Went down to Yazd, which is the ancient home of Zoroastrians. So there's like a temple with a flame that burns all the time. And we kind of did a loop around, stayed in the middle of the desert in this caravanserai, which is like this, it's where the ancient like camel herders or nomadic people would stay. It's like now it's like a tourist hotel sort of, but it's very informal. It's like almost like a fort kind of a thing. It's like this round thing with like a central plaza, open air in the middle. And so they would like open up the gates. People would like bring their camels in, like tie them up, and they'd stay in these places around the outside. It was actually super hot when we were there, and there was, the fans didn't really help. So we actually ended up just going to the roof and sleeping up there. And it was actually really comfortable sleeping under the stars in the desert. But that was a really interesting local experience. And then we did the loop around Iran, and then finally went up to Mashhad, the other big city in Iran. We visited the Imam Reza Shrine, which is the holiest site in Iran, one of the largest mosques in the world. And then eventually crossed out of the country into Turkmenistan.
Turkmenistan. That's an interesting country.
It's a very interesting country, yeah. And even the Iranians we spoke to, we said we're going to Turkmenistan, and they were like, "Oh, the people there, they're crazy over there." Like I mean, people say it's the second most authoritarian country in the world after North Korea, and the capital Ashgabat people describe as a cross between Las Vegas and Pyongyang. And I think that's accurate. Yes.
I can't imagine that.
Yes.
But for just quickly to finish on Iran, it's definitely worth visiting, isn't it? I know we
Oh yeah,
also get scared about visiting there because of what you've been told and read about. But I think if you get a tour there, especially if you're American, Canadian, Brits, I think you've been Irish now. I think add it to the list. I think you do
hmm
have to get a tour. But that's great because you get someone local, right? And you probably see some pretty cool stuff anyway.
yeah. I mean, like anywhere, it probably depends on your tour guide and how good of a
Of course.
guide they are, and if they're
Yeah.
showing you the kinds of things you want. I don't know about going right now because I've heard the situation's
Yeah.
not so great right now in Iran. But in general, yeah, it's a really fascinating country. I would love to go back someday if I could. It's especially as a journalist, which like I kind of have to be a little careful
Sure.
going as a
Yeah. Yeah.
journalist. But it's just fascinating to meet people and hear their stories. So I really enjoyed my trip there.
Awesome. Yeah, we live amongst a lot of Persians here in North Vancouver, so they have a huge population here. Apparently, because the mountains behind look like Tehran, so I think they
Oh,
all move
really?
here. That's the
Oh, very
reason.
cool.
That's what the locals tell me, anyway. But
Hmm.
super nice people, like the nicest people you'll meet.
Hmm.
Okay, and just to finish on the Mongol Rally, when you get to the end, is it like a fanfare, or is it just like, oh, we're finished, or like what's it like finishing?
After all the challenges we had, all the times we broke down, all of the, when we got stranded, we didn't even have time to get into the story, but getting stranded in the middle of Mongolia and having to get rescued, by the Mongolian National Emergency Management
Oh,
Agency.
okay,
We,
right,
yeah, there's so many stories to tell from this trip, but
yeah,
just all the trouble that we went through and everything. And we were hoping that we would get to the end, to the finish line, and there'd be people cheering us, greeting us. And there was nothing. There was nothing at all. Um, because there's hundreds of teams that did the rally, and whenever
sure,
they get to the
yeah.
finish line is whenever they get to the finish line, so it's
Mhm.
staggered, so they can't have people always there cheering you. So I get that. So it was definitely a little underwhelming, but it was definitely a case where the journey was more important than the destination.
Classic. That's a classic quote, that, isn't it?
Yes.
And I was actually going to ask in Mongolia, was the ending nicer? But I guess the roads probably are not as good as what maybe you thought, or were they actually okay?
I mean, as I said, it was much of the country. It was just tracks through the
Tracks.
sand and the grass. You're just following of whatever vehicle went ahead of you. You see lines on the map and on GPS of like a road, but it's just tracks. And then you come to river crossings, and you got to drive across these shallow little rivers, at which are little tiny
Crikey.
Nissan Micra. I can't go through very deep water. So that I mean that led I'll just tell the abbreviated version of the story, but that led one day to us. We got caught in one river crossing, and then we saw another one coming up on the map, and so we wanted to try to avoid it.
Mm.
And so we saw this line on the map on our GPS that looked like it went parallel to the main road, and we figured, okay, it looks like maybe we could go that way and sort of avoid the river crossing and meet up with the main road a little bit later on, which is all well and good if you're on flat terrain, but Mongolia in many areas is very kind of hilly, and our little
Okay.
cars don't have a lot of horsepower for going
No.
up these steep mountains. And so we ended up, to make a long story short, at both of our cars at the bottom of this like really rocky ravine, like this canyon in the absolute middle of nowhere. Mongolia, I should mention, has the lowest population density of any country in the
Yep.
world. So there's
Yeah.
no one around for miles and miles. We were totally stranded there. Our cars just could not make it up either back the way we came or up the other side. There was all these rocks. We tried putting the floor mats under the door, under the tires, to try to get traction. Nothing worked. Thankfully, we had these satellite devices. We ended up sending a text by satellite to a friend back in the UK, who in turn reached out to the British and American embassies in Ulaanbaatar, or the capital on the other side of the country. They dispatched a team, actually a couple teams, from the Mongolian National Emergency Management Agency to come rescue us. So we had this like emergency extraction. They towed us out. And actually a few weeks after, and we met them at the embassy when we got to Ulaanbaatar, that they're curious in hearing our whole story. We A few months or later, after we got back from our trip, the embassy actually emailed us a photo of the American ambassador to Mongolia, presenting at some kind of ceremony, presenting a certificate of appreciation to the head of the Mongolian National Emergency Management Agency for rescuing us. We were
Oh,
apparently the first American drivers they had ever rescued. So I like to think we made history and caused an international incident. So
yeah.
that was quite memorable.
You improved relations.
Yeah, I guess so. Yes.
Oh, that's amazing. What a way to finish after all that journey. And then you got
Yes.
that to deal with. Crikey.
Yes, definitely. So it made getting to the finish line even more momentous.
Yeah, absolutely. What a journey that is. I think I read the other day that Ulaanbaatar only has the paved roads. I think the rest of the country is
Yeah.
like you said, tracks and that's it.
Well, I
Um,
think that though I think they've been making an effort to pave more of it. So I'm trying to think, maybe a few years from now, if people do the Mongol Rally and it'll all be paved roads,
yeah,
like they
just
won't
be
have to go through
plain
everything
sailing.
we did. I'll be like, when I was your age. So yeah, won't be quite the adventure. And we went
Awesome.
on the southern route, which was supposed to be the easier of the two, easier than the northern
Mm.
route. I can't imagine what the northern route would have been on if knowing our experience.
Okay, and to finish, there's a couple of key lessons from the trip. Is it like maybe perseverance, bit of patience, trust the locals, bit of process like that? Is there anything that really comes to the top of your mind?
Yeah. Uh, I mean, first of all, the people say it's a small world, but when you're actually in a vehicle driving across the world, it does not seem like a small world. Like people who say, "Oh, it's a small world," they're just talking about the big cities, but there's
Of course.
vast expanses of land in between the cities.
Mm.
And when you actually circumnavigate, I mean, we basically drove a quarter of the way around the earth, when you add up all so it's, yeah, I can say it's definitely not a small world. I got to see actually the changes in geography. The mountains turn into valleys, turn into deserts, turn into. Um, so that's one takeaway. Also, that the world is not a big, bad, scary place like people think it
Hmm.
is. It's easy to think that when you see the headlines, but oftentimes it's not that way when you actually get to a place. And there are genuinely dangerous parts of the world, but
Sure.
instead of, you can't necessarily tell by reading the news or seeing the travel alerts from the State Department or reading the headlines. I mean, I always think you need to talk to people on the ground. If the locals say it's not safe, don't come here, I'll trust what they say because I
Yeah,
think,
absolutely.
that's good advice.
Mm.
But it's really hard to know from afar. But in general, the world is not a big, bad, scary place. Wherever you are, if you're totally lost, if you're broken down on the side of the road, if you need help, people are generally good people. Wherever you go in the
Mm.
world, they'll be willing to stop and help you out. And even if you don't speak their language, you communicate somehow by drawing little pictures in the dirt or on the sand on the ground or in the dirt on the back of the windshield or whatever, and communicate. Okay, send a tow truck tomorrow morning. That we somehow managed. And then I think my other big takeaway is this is, I guess, more specific to me, but having grown up here in northern New Jersey outside of New York, and I have so many friends who've moved here to New York City, from
Mm.
Iowa, from Oklahoma, from the middle of nowhere, they come to New York City and they all think New York City is the center of the universe. And I'm finally here and I can't imagine living anywhere else. And as someone who's traveled extensively, I could tell you definitively that New York City is not the center of the
Yeah.
universe, that it's such a big world. There's so many cool and interesting places. There's so many cities and countries, places that are far more interesting, far more affordable, far more, modern or better in many ways than New York
Mm.
City. And I feel like people who just live in, whether it's New York or wherever you live, and they say this is the best place in the world, we're number one, this is they're just naive, like they're missing out on so many other experiences. They can't imagine ever living anywhere else. But have you ever like spend some time in these other places and you'll realize that there are some other really cool places.
Yeah, I do rate New York. I think it's a great city, but it's only up to a point, right? It's only the top three favorite cities for me at the minute because that's all I've experienced. Now I could be experiencing five more cities in the next, I don't know, 2 years,
Right.
and they might take it, right?
Right.
So the people who claim it's the best place to be, and it's hard to claim that when you've not been to every place.
Yeah.
It's a
Right.
huge claim.
Right.
um, yeah, Mongolia seems vast. It seems like the old days of traveling. I reckon it's still probably quite rustic. I'd imagine. Maybe a bit like traveling in I don't know the 80s or 90s when internet wasn't really a thing. So I can imagine that's pretty cool. You just remind me of someone I met in India, 2016 actually, same year,
Mm-hmm.
and he was in the British Army as a cavalier, so he rode horses and stuff. And he was telling us about his experience in Mongolia because he can ride a horse. He was living with the nomadic people, contributing to their like local community because he can ride horses, go and get stuff, help out. I thought it was an incredible story, but he had to ship his bike because China's a bit difficult with vehicles, like you said. So he was biking on his motorbike from Europe all the way, but he stopped off in India. But yeah, he was loving it. In 2016, he said that's one of the best experiences he ever had.
Mm-hmm. And one other takeaway, I think, is that there's this great quote from a travel writer named Tim Cahill. He said, "An adventure is simply physical and emotional discomfort recalled in tranquility."
Yes.
And that, I mean, all the moments where we were stranded somewhere, where we had to call for help, where we were broken down yet again, where we all had to think like, can we continue on with this journey? Like, should we just give up and go home? Like, this is so bad. But then after the fact, it leaves you with these amazing stories to tell. Like, you go to a bar or something and you're like the life of the party, and you have these incredible stories, these memories that you keep with you for the rest of your life. And I feel like that's a big part of travel. Like, if unless you're on a Club Med vacation or something, if you travel out somewhere, especially in the developing world, no matter how much planning you do, there are inevitably going to be these moments where things are beyond your control. Things happen, things go wrong, and you just deal with it the best you can. But then it's these crazy memories you have afterwards that kind of make it all worthwhile.
I mean, imagine not having those stories. That's what probably drives me
Yeah,
to travel as much as I can, right?
right,
Imagine you get
right.
to your 60s and you're a bit tired and you got some stories to tell, but you've not done anything apart from just work and that's it.
Hmm.
I mean,
Yeah,
yeah, it amazes me people don't travel that much. But, yeah, there's a lot of reasons for that, but that's also to do with privilege and passport and all that sort of stuff. If you're in a Western country and you've got the ability to save a bit of money and go traveling, and you don't do it, I don't quite get it because you've now got this story to tell. I've got some stories as well, and I imagine not having those. Yeah, you got to have a story when you get to the end. Got to
yeah,
have a story.
yeah. So I did the whole first season of my podcast was documenting this crazy journey drive to Mongolia. That was my trip, the
Yeah.
journey there, which I documented that. And then actually when I got to the finish line, I decided crazily to drive all the way back.
No.
Not the same, not the same way, across Siberia, different way. I figured, when am I going to be in that part of the world again? And so I wanted to kind of keep finding interesting stories to tell, and to document for my show.
The
Yep.
funny thing is, I wasn't going to ask that question because I assumed it was like, I just get rid of your car, you fly back.
Well, you could leave
Yeah,
the
you could
car
do
at,
that.
at a
Yeah.
ra- at a railhead in Russia. You basically you couldn't abandon it in Russia because import fees or whatever. So they
Yeah.
basically had to ship the car back to anywhere in the EU, and they would dispose of it in the
Mm,
EU. So I think they sent it to Latvia or Lithuania or somewhere, and they sent it to a junkyard there or something.
yeah.
And we actually did that to our car because our car had so many problems. But our friends who we were caravanning with, Jane, she lives in the UK, and so
Yeah.
I actually drove back her car. And
Wow.
so I drove across Siberia, and which is not the most interesting place. I don't know what I was thinking, but I did get to go to Chernobyl along the way, which we could talk about, and went to some other places. But anyway, my point is, after that first season of the podcast where I documented that one trip, ever since then, I've been taking like individual trips to different places, reporting stories from my
Mm,
travels. And the ayahuasca experience in Peru was one of them. And so, as I was saying, I was in Lima for like a month a number of years ago, and I met this curandero, natural cure guy, Lucho, who took me to find this stone-shaped star that apparently had magical healing powers that he saw in this hallucinogenic vision. And then he called me up like a week or two later and said, "Hey, he leads these ayahuasca experiences with,
yeah.
these hallucinogenic potion that he brews from roots and plants in the jungle that, he takes people, he does these healing, therapy sessions, whatever, for people. It's supposed to cure them of all sorts of things. And so he invited me to come along and said, "Hey, would you like to come and witness this?" So yeah, so I joined him, and it's definitely not like what many Westerners think of ayahuasca retreats, where it's like you're, in this calm environment. Like, this was a real local thing. We went to this like shanty town way in the outskirts of Lima, in these like people's living room with this like bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling. I mean, it was really out there. And
Mm,
it's like people sitting around this room, and it's more than just the ayahuasca potion. There's a whole big ceremony that goes with it, where he's chanting and he has a harmonica, and he's has like these cigars with tobacco from the jungle, and he's like purifying, like sprinkling, almost like a priest, like blessing people. And so it's interesting to watch the whole ceremony, see how it unfolds, learn about it and all the different ingredients and everything he's using. And so I got to witness that. And as part of that, he offered to give me a little bit of
Yeah.
ayahuasca. Here's a short clip from my podcast of when he offered to give me some of the ayahuasca.
En la cielo ayahuasca y doctorcito y curandero y limpiaremos cuerpo y manta linda
As he sang, Juliana sat next to him with the Bible in front of her on the table. Her eyes were closed, but her arms were outstretched with her palms open towards the ceiling, as if she was deep in concentration and prayer. There was a single fluorescent light bulb hanging in the center of the room, which gave everything a cold and clinical look, hardly the comforting atmosphere you would hope for an experience like this. After his song ended, Lucho gave the bottle of ayahuasca a final shake, and then offered me some.
A ver, vamos a empezar, Scott.
Solo un poquito.
Yes.
Just a little, I reminded him. Okay. In true Peruvian fashion, I was apparently going to be the koi, the guinea pig, for the rest of the group. He poured out about an ounce of it into his wooden cup. I held it up to my nose. Smells strong. Okay, here we go. Extremely bitter. Ugh. Ugh. Okay. But so he offered to give me a little bit of this ayahuasca. Just initially, I wasn't going to take it because I mean, I don't really do any kinds of drugs or anything. I don't even smoke pot or anything. But I figured, kind of in the interest of journalism, I would, take he was just going to give me like a little tiny bit, like a couple ounces or whatever.
Yeah.
And so he gave it to me. It was very bitter tasting. But it was interesting. I'm sitting there, we're in this dark room, I'm recording this whole, event, everything that's going on, and he continues chanting, and the people around me start having these like crazy experiences. They start getting a little sick because one of the side effects of ayahuasca, makes you a little sick, and I have like hours of audio of people vomiting in buckets. And so, and people are starting to have these crazy hallucinations. And meanwhile, I'm sitting there and, my stomach felt a little bit of a knot, and then it went away. And then, and Lucho keeps turning to me. He's like, do you feel anything yet? I was like, no, no. I was almost like embarrassed. Like, everyone's having these crazy, like life-changing experiences. And I'm just still sitting there like, okay, I'm still recording. Like, I did more recently, I did like an updated version of that episode where I interviewed this woman who's she's a travel blogger, and she's actually spent time with a shaman, a similar guy in Peru.
Mm-hmm.
And so she knows a lot about ayahuasca. And she told me that, my thinking that, well, maybe I was immune to it, or maybe, all kinds of things. Like I was just thinking about it the wrong way. That, I, first of all, I probably didn't have enough of it maybe to have a reaction, but also I was like in journalist mode and I wasn't like totally relaxing. And also
that work
it was,
mode. Yeah.
Yeah. And also just the whole experience where it was in these like hard backed wooden chairs. It wasn't like a place where I could really get comfortable and relax. Yeah, I really wasn't really in the right frame of mind or physically in the right, situation or location to really experience it the way that some of these other people were. So it probably wasn't fair for me to say, oh, I'm immune to it. It's, I still believed, I didn't think they were making it up. I mean, I respect,
of course.
I respect what they're doing and everything. It just didn't work for me for whatever reason, but I probably would have to try it again sometime to really experience it. I don't know if I'll do that. Maybe I will, but it was interesting just to watch this whole ceremony unfold. And there's one woman at one point who, was having these crazy hallucinations, and watching Lucho basically, it was like watching him perform an exorcism, like casting demons out of this woman.
Yeah, that's the vision I've got. Yeah.
It was creepy. Really one of the strangest experiences I've ever witnessed. Really interesting. It's kind of creepy audio to listen back to if people hear that episode I did from that. You gotta be in the right frame of mind to hear it. But it was a trip, like literally. It was interesting.
Just a couple of things from me. please head to my new website, www.wingingittravelpodcast.com. The link is in the show notes. And secondly, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. And I'm really enjoying showing you my content I have from the last year or so. Thank you. I thought when you were going to explain the situation that you might be somewhere like in my background, the trees and sort of somewhere in nature, not just in a room with a light bulb. And
Yeah,
you always gave me like a seance type environment where people sit around like, in a little dark room and do some stuff. So that's quite interesting. I thought it would be like in nature and a bit more based on that.
If I did it again, that's what I would do, like more of a retreat-like environment. And also this woman I interviewed said that ideally it should be the person leading it should, especially if it's like my first experience, it should be someone who, I mean, again, my Spanish isn't great, so I kind of understood what was going on, but I didn't understand everything. It would be someone who I could communicate with better, who could speak English, who also would understand American culture, understand like the cultural baggage that I'm bringing to the situation, and just be able to explain things much better to me to get me in the right frame of mind, to undergo an experience like that. She thought something like that would be really helpful. So if anyone's ever considering experiencing something like this, if you go to some kind of like retreat-like environment, you'd probably, where it's someone who caters to like tourists or whatever, you'd probably get a lot more out of it.
Yeah, it's supposed to cleanse some demons, right? I suppose it's supposed to get sort of reset yourself, isn't it? I guess that's the idea behind it.
It's not a drug in the sense of people don't do it to get high. I mean, you're vomiting and everything. It's not a comfortable experience, but it's supposed to kind of give you new insights, make new connections in the synapses in your brain or whatever. And it's obviously different for every person, and I think there could be some risks if you have like a history of mental illness or something, but for the average person, it works differently for each person apparently, but it could have some beneficial ways of rethinking about your place in the world and in life and all of that.
I think I mentioned before we start recording, there's a local sort of doctor here, he's quite well known, called Gabor Mate. He's like a physician, I think, but he talks about ayahuasca because he took it himself, despite he treated a lot of people on the downtown east side in Vancouver, which is pretty hairy if you walk down there with people in the opioid crisis. And I think he'd done it just to probably see where he's at with a lot of stuff with that, but also his history of being in Hungary during Nazi Germany. So I think it's quite interesting. So I mean, people can read his experiences, but they can also listen to your podcast and hear your reporting on it as well. More of a visualizing people doing it more than actually being in it yourself. And I do want to touch on Chernobyl 100% because we've all probably seen the documentary, sort of drama documentary about it, right? I think it was
HBO.
on, was it HBO?
Yeah.
Amazing, I thought. And probably needed because I didn't know much about it. You hear about it. But what was your experience? I guess that's on the way back from your Mongol Rally. So why did you visit? And how can you visit there? Is it a guided tour? Can you just turn up?
No, you can't just turn up. No.
Yeah.
And I don't know what the situation is now. I'm guessing they're not leading tours right now with everything going on.
Yeah.
But when I went again, this is in the, I guess, autumn of 2016 on the way back. So I drove across Siberia, across Russia, went into Moscow for like a day or two, and then went south into Ukraine. And my mother's side of the family is Ukrainian. So I was kind of curious from a cultural perspective. I grew up with some of these traditional foods and everything. My grandmother still spoke Ukrainian. So I was curious to see this kind of country of my ancestors. And while, if you go to Kyiv, you got to go to Chernobyl. It's a day trip, from Kyiv. It's just north of there. And there are, or at least were, tour companies that would take people on. You go on a tour bus up for the day. And people don't realize that you can visit Chernobyl or could visit Chernobyl. That at the time we went, I think they said there was something like 20,000 tourists a year who went. And after the thing came out on HBO, I think it increased even much more so.
Yeah.
And you go on this tour for the day, and they, on the way up there, you watch, showing you documentaries in the bus and everything about the history. And in theory, they say the tours aren't allowed to like take you in any of the buildings or anything, but they all do. Like they all, and the government, I think, turns, looks the other way. And you're walking through a lot of these abandoned buildings where, people, just abandon that. You still see calendars on the walls from 1986 when, they had to abandon these villages and people were told you'd be able to return, a few days later, and they've never been allowed back. And the guides, they know there are certain areas you can't go. I mean, they have Geiger counters, and they could tell you, like, you're fine here on the pavement. Don't step off the pavement into the grass over there. Definitely don't go into the red forest over there, which is like one of the highest, areas of highest contamination in the world, where many of the Russian soldiers went at when they were invading Ukraine, and they ended up getting really sick and shipped off to Belarus.
Wow.
Yeah, and the Ukrainians who were overseeing Chernobyl, they tried to tell the Russian soldiers, don't go there, and the Russians just didn't listen to them, and they ended up getting violently sick. And who knows if even any of them are even still alive. But so there are areas that are really not safe to go to. But then other areas, like in the buildings and everything, like you're getting some radiation, but there's a chart they gave us, and it's basically comparable to like getting x-rays at the dentist or something, and it also depends how long you're spending there. Like you could go there for the day or two, but you couldn't like live there full time because it's like cumulative over time, the radiation exposure you would get. So yeah, we're going into some of these abandoned buildings, like, nurseries and community centers, and they have different tours you could take. Like if you really want to experience it, there's like a place you could sleep over, and there's still some like local residents, like older people who live in like the perimeter of one of the areas around Chernobyl. They just refuse to leave, or they have to leave initially, but then they let them come back. They won't let any new people live there, but like these older people, they'll let them live and like die off there. And surprisingly, they don't have really high incidences of cancer, whatever you would expect. But if you take one of these longer tours, apparently you could go meet some of them. They'll show you some of the other areas, like the grocery stores and places that we didn't get to visit on our tour. But super fascinating place. Definitely the eeriest place I've ever visited. You visiting the abandoned amusement park, which everyone's seen in all these photos, which they had built and was due to open like a few days after the explosion, and then the explosion at the nuclear plant happened, the meltdown, and then the government was trying to distract people and like calm them down, don't get them worried, so they actually opened the amusement park earlier. And so when people should be evacuating, they're going on rides and on Ferris wheels and bumper cars, and it's just super dark and grim. So just to see these rides like overgrown with weeds and everything, it's super creepy, like this juxtaposition of like what should be this joyous experience with this really dark. It's like seeing killer clowns or something. It's really creepy, and it's definitely one of the top 3 or 4 things I've ever done, like places I've ever been to. Really cool.
I think, take the explosion and the situation out of it a little bit, it's just so unique to see somewhere just abandoned. And I guess it gives you a sense of maybe in the future where this situation didn't happen, but human beings just left. Just left a place, and what would that actually look like? I mean, I guess it's a case, arguably, to say, well, this is what it looks like. It's just a weird, unique experience.
Yeah, and there's people who are into this, like that's really what they focus on, like this what they call dark tourism.
Yeah, dark tourism.
Like to explore abandoned buildings, and I don't specialize in that. Like it would be creepy to do that all the time. But in that case, I think not just the fact that it was abandoned, but knowing the whole history behind it and everything, I think was super fascinating. But it is interesting to see like how things over time, how they change. Just like a few weeks ago, I was in Riga, Latvia, and I went to, there's a KGB museum there, and seeing the old, local headquarters of the KGB there, and seeing all these like prison cells with the paint peeling and everything. And from, hasn't existed as a prison since I think 1991. So it's been several decades, but just seeing this kind of wreckage of, in some ways I appreciate that things are kept the way they were, because if they just repainted it and everything, like it doesn't feel as real. Like it would just seem like a glitzy tourism kind of thing. But actually seeing the way it was, and it feels more kind of historic in some ways.
You know what? I didn't even know also you could visit from Kiev, because I've been to Kiev quite a long time ago now, over 10 years ago. But maybe it wasn't on our radar. Maybe we thought, oh, you can't go there, but actually you could.
Yeah,
It's a bit
I
annoying, isn't
highly
it?
recommend it if anyone ever goes to Kyiv. Definitely
Yeah.
look into taking a tour of Chernobyl if you can.
Okay. I've got some sort of like travel, not philosophy questions, but I want to know what type of travel you are. We talked a little bit about it before about slow travel. So I
Mhm.
think that does kind of answer a few of my questions. When you're leisurely traveling, though, not for work, do you count that as like holidays or vacations, or do you still try and insert that travel mindset of slow travel?
No, I mean, I always like slow travel, whether it's work or even if I'm not
Wow.
necessarily looking for a story. And I do try to always keep my eye out for a potential story when I go somewhere.
Yeah.
I try to like every trip I go on, I try to come back with at least a story for my podcast. But even if I'm not doing that, I still like to travel slowly. Like I still like to really know a place really well and understand it well. Even if it's just for my own interest and edification. Like I want to feel like I don't want to just like get a taste of a place and like leave and go on to somewhere else and feel like, oh, I barely got to see that first place. Like I would just,
Mm,
I'd rather see fewer places but more in depth than see a bunch of places, in a really shallow level.
got it. Okay. And that kind of goes to the next question. So this is an interesting one. How do you travel? I mean, I've got backpack and mid-range luxury here, but to slow travel, that's got to be dependent on your own sort of situation with budget and stuff, right? So how
Yeah,
would
I mean, it
you
definitely couldn't be
define it?
luxury
No,
travel. And I'm not a big into luxury anyway.
no.
On the other hand, I've never been a big fan of hostels, and I think especially the older I get. Though sometimes I could tolerate them if like the ones where instead of just bunk beds, we were like built into the wall and you have privacy curtains and
Oh
everything.
yeah,
Those are a little bit
yeah.
better. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, mainly it's the snoring that gets to me. The more people in the room, inevitably you'll have at least one or two snorers, and that just drives me crazy. And
Earplugs
even bringing
key.
your yeah, yeah, they only do so good. Um, so yeah, and I like my privacy too. Like I do like having my own room, even if it's a shared bathroom down the hallway. I really kind of like having my own space, my own room.
Hmm.
And sometimes there's hostels, sometimes they'll have private rooms, but you end up paying as much as anywhere else. So why even stay at a hostel at that point?
Yeah, no, hostels are
Um,
crazy right now. Yeah.
yeah, I stay at a lot of Airbnbs, as problematic as Airbnb sometimes is. If you stay in a place like if it's like an owner occupied place where you're like with the person there, like they'll be like your guide, or they'll tell
Mm,
you like, oh, you should check out this place. Like, again, that's better than a tour guidebook or anything, like having a
sure.
local person make recommendations. And I found some stories like the one in Peru, the Jeffrey, the Airbnb host who put me in touch with Lucho, the curandero. Like I wouldn't have found Lucho if I
Mm,
had been there staying with Jeffrey. So Airbnbs are cool. I don't usually stay at hotels just because it seems so like it there's not a lot of character a lot of times. They just all seem the same unless you stay at some kind of boutique hotel, but then it gets kind of pricey.
hmm.
And I'm open to couch surfing, but I've never had any luck because it seems like there's so much competition all the time. And usually, from what I understand, couch surfing usually that's just for like a night or two. Like you're not
Yeah,
going to stay
normally.
very long. Recently, I've gotten big into house sitting as a way
Okay.
to travel long term, like because if I want to stay in a place for like a month or more, like that's a way to have they usually don't pay you, but you've got a free place to stay.
Mm,
You have access to a kitchen, so you could cook all your own food, which is
yeah.
great. That really helps me feel rooted in a place where I could cook my own meals.
Hmm.
And it's also super affordable. Like last year I spent like 2 months in Copenhagen, which is a really expensive city, even for
Expensive.
me coming
Yeah.
from New York. But I was able to go to a local grocery store and do all my own shopping and cook all my own meals. And when I divided up everything in the end, looked over all my credit card receipts and everything, like I was spending like $200 a week, which is like nothing.
Mm,
Super cheap in one of the world's most expensive cities. So house sitting is great. And I've totally gotten into this. I started originally because I had a friend, a neighbor who lived down the block from me, who sold her house and was essentially homeless for several years, just house sitting around the world. from Thailand to Jamaica to, she's actually the one who put me in touch with this woman in Copenhagen because she had house set for this woman a bunch of times. And there's people who do this full time, like they just house sit around the world. And it's a great way to like see places and spend a lot of time in a place. There are some responsibilities that come with it, usually caring for a pet. Sometimes not if you get lucky to, watering house plants. So sometimes it has to do other odds and ends, but that's not a big deal. Like it doesn't take that much time. And you're like living in a house. Like it feels like I love visiting a place, spending enough time there where I feel more like a local than a tourist. And house sitting is a great way to do that.
Yeah, it's very popular these days, isn't it?
Yeah, which means more competition. I'm on those sites, and in fact, I'm looking for my next opportunity right now. So I've just been scouring work away last night.
Okay.
So we'll see. But yeah, there's a variety of different sites I look at, and I'm always looking for other places to find. There's a bunch of Facebook groups I'm part of as well. To just look for different options, and I'm also looking into different. There's like co-working sites you could go to, and like all kinds of different options. Yeah.
And as you mentioned that there, what is up your sleeve for travel this year?
Yeah, it's kind of tricky because I would have had a different answer if I'd spoken to you like 2 days ago.
Oh, okay.
So this last year, I did quite a lot of traveling last year. It's crazy. I was just looking back at the calendar and was like, wow, that was all this last year. I went so many places. It's a great way to like somehow make your life seem longer. Like when you cram in so much, it's crazy. So I said I was in Copenhagen for like a couple months last year, and then I was in Oaxaca, Mexico for a few months because it's a great city. So my brother actually was getting married in Oaxaca back in November. And so I figured if I was going to go down there for the wedding anyway, in November, I should go a few weeks early to go there for Day of the Dead at the end of October or beginning of November. So I went there, and then so I ended up staying with some people, kind of helping cat sit for them for like a few months. And then while I was there, I met this Canadian couple who have a house just outside of Oaxaca. And they said, hey, do you want to house sit for us? We live in Oaxaca half the year and we're in Canada half the year. And we go down there to like escape the Canadian winter, but then we have 3 cats that we leave in Oaxaca. We don't bring back to Canada with us. So do you want to like house sit and cat sit for us for like 6 months from May to November or to October? And that sounded like a great opportunity, which is longer than I'd usually spend in a place. But right now I'm kind of in between seasons on my podcast, and I'm always like on the go, and I need to like stay put in one place long enough to like edit all my material for the next season. And then also just to spend so much time in a Latin American country to finally take some language classes and become like totally fluent in Spanish.
Yeah, it's on my list.
It would be a real, because once I achieve total fluency, that opens up almost the whole hemisphere for me,
Yes.
And for whatever reason, I've always been really interested in Latin America. So, so I had that all lined up, and then that just fell through at the last minute. Unfortunately, they ended up getting someone else, but they're still interested in having me come, but maybe next year instead or something. So, so now I don't know. That was my next big plan of going there from May to October. So now I'm kind of figuring out where to go instead. I still would love to find somewhere else in Latin America, like I said, to spend at least 3-4 months to really become totally fluent. Those longer term house sitting gigs are sometimes they're a little harder to find. So I'm looking around to see what my options are, or I may just stay here at home for the next few months just to like bang out the next season of my podcast. I don't know, but that's one of my next big goals, to become totally fluent in Spanish. And then once I do that, I have a listener of my podcast who's invited me to come to Venezuela sometime. He has some relatives there, which would be amazing. But again, if you're with some local people, I feel like it's safer. They could tell you where to go, and I would stay with them and everything. And so, there's so many parts of the world I still want to travel to. But I'm still figuring out what my next step is at this point now that things fell through. So hopefully, maybe if you interview me in another week or so, I may have a better answer, but we'll see.
That's good, because you're in between now. Anything can crop up.
I'm open to, there's nothing holding me down. Like I said, I have my laptop. I can go anywhere with an internet connection. So I've got my house here in New Jersey, but I've got a few housemates who watch after it and pay me rent when I'm traveling. So it works out. Yeah.
going somewhere like Venezuela or Mexico to learn a language, right? It's on my list.
Yeah.
I'm okay at Spanish. I know basics, but I'm not like even beyond basic. But I'm convinced that you can learn a certain amount in a class, and that's it. You do need to immerse yourself in a Spanish speaking country to get fluent at least, or at
It
least
would
get
help.
really good at it. And I'm convinced of that. So yeah, that's one of my aims in the future. And that's part of slow travel, right? You can stay there 3,
Yeah.
4, 5, 6 months and really learn it.
Right. Yes,
Yeah,
that's the best way. I think so.
can't wait. Okay, and we're going to go onto your podcast. You mentioned it a few times in the interview, Far From Home. Why did you start the podcast? And can you tell listeners how you produce your podcast and what is it about?
Okay, so the idea for the podcast originally came about with the idea to go on the Mongol Rally. I actually skipped over this story, but my brother and I got in the habit at a certain point of taking a big trip every year over
Mm.
Christmas and New Year's because we didn't have a lot of close family in the area.
Yeah.
And after our mom died, especially, we figured rather than just sit home at Christmas and make dinner for ourselves or whatever, we should go somewhere interesting. So we went one year to Thailand and Cambodia. We went to Alaska and went dog sledding and saw or tried to see the Northern Lights and all that. We went to the Galapagos Islands and then Ecuador one year. And then another year we went to Cuba. And while we're on that trip to Cuba, we went in a tour group. We don't usually do tour groups. We figured for Cuba it might be a little easier. And we had some issues with our guide who kind of got drunk and abandoned our tour group one evening. And so all of us in the tour group kind of bonded in the absence of a tour guide. And he eventually came back. And so one of the people in the tour group is a woman, Rosie, who's like middle-aged. She's a Brit, but now she lives in Australia. And her husband Alan were there, and we became good friends. We all kept in touch after we got back. And a number of months later, Rosie reached out to my brother and me and said, "Hey, me and my best friend Jane are planning on going on the Mongol Rally, this crazy adventure." And so that's how that came about. And so it was pretty early on, when we decided, she asked us, "Do you want to go on this trip with us?" And we said, "Yeah, it sounds amazing." That I thought I should make a podcast about this, not just the trip itself, but even just all the preparation that went into it. As you could imagine, a journey like this, I mean, it took months and months of planning, figuring out the route, getting the visas, getting the vaccinations, figuring out what kind of car do we buy. Like, we even took a basic first aid class and a basic car repair class and like all these things. And so just documenting that whole journey, that whole experience leading up to it, and then the trip itself, I figured this would be perfect for a podcast, the whole season of the podcast, documenting this. So that's how the podcast first came about. And like I said, the first season was documenting this trip. And ever since the trip, I've been doing individual episodes from my trips to other parts of the world. And it's been going ever since, with some kind of gaps in between. During like COVID, I wasn't really traveling so much. And so had to be a little bit creative during that period. I, for example, did this whole COVID stories series where I had friends and colleagues around the world just record like voice memos on their iPhones and send them to me of like, what's the situation with COVID-19 where you live in the world. And I know lots of people in lots of places, so I got to hear from lots of obscure parts of the world, or places that people don't normally hear. Right, people sent me voice memos from Lithuania to Haiti to Guam to like all fascinating parts of the world. It's really interesting to hear what was going on this global level. And I've been doing the podcast ever since, and I'm about to launch I guess it would be my 4th season now.
And it's like an immersive experience, right? I think we talked before the podcast started that you tend to like get the listener involved with your travels, as opposed to one like this where it's like an interview chat.
Yeah, it's not an interview show. I mean, I'll occasionally do interviews, but not very often. Usually I try to really use the power of audio to transport people places where they're listening, and some people describe it as like movies for their ears. The whole documenting the Mongol Rally, I'm not like sitting back in our Airbnb at the end of the day describing what happened that day. I actually brought a microphone with me, and you're hearing the sound as we're broken down on the side of the road and changing a flat tire or whatever. Like, the listeners actually come along with us. And I mean, the greatest compliment people give me is they often say they listen, they say, "Oh, I felt like I was there with you." Like, that's what I'm trying to do, like get people, maybe a little bit out of their comfort zone, but like take them on these journeys with me through the comfort of their headphones from wherever they are. Yeah.
Yeah. Almost the best type of travel podcast, I think.
Yeah, and there's not a lot of people who do it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite hard to produce. I think I was going to
Yes.
say it
Right.
requires like a lot of moving parts and things. You know,
Yes.
the sound, and you got to immerse yourself, and is it a great story? All these things come into it. It's
Yeah.
way harder, but it is way better.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
so.
it's
Yeah.
amazing. Yeah, yeah, nice one on that. And you say you don't do guests normally, but there's occasional interviews, right?
Once in a while.
Yeah,
What I do sometimes is I'll do a long interview with someone like with Thor Peterson, like talking about his
sure. Yeah, yeah.
journey around the world, but then I'll take out most of my questions and I'll score it with music. And so it's just like him telling the story.
Mm,
So I'll do that occasionally. So it's still like an immersive experience, even obviously almost all the audio I get is built initially around interviews I did, but I take out my questions and I like build it into more of like an audio like listening experience, more of like a cinematic experience when they listen back to it. Yeah.
maybe some episodes people should check out if they're checking you out for the first time.
Sure. I mean, definitely the first season, if they just go start all the way at the very beginning, and depending on what podcast listening app they're in, they might have to switch to the first season, but definitely check that out so you hear the whole journey of the Mongol Rally. Third season, I started off with during COVID and everything. And this is also when there was all the protests of George Floyd, the protests for racial
Mhm.
justice and everything. So I actually had this episode, which I really liked, where I just interviewed a few of my African American friends, talking about traveling while Black, like their experience as Black people, like traveling around the world. Because there's not, at least Americans, there aren't that many Black Americans who travel
Mm.
widely to many of around the world. Like it's just they would visit a lot of these places, and especially like my friend Nate describing in like the Balkans and like going to Serbia and Montenegro, and so, and these people like looking at him like they had never like seen a Black person in the flesh before. And just the stories some of my friends told me, and some of them of course are really kind of sad about how they were treated, but some of them are actually hilarious. Being in like Buenos Aires, and my friend Nate and our other high school friend Alvin like waiting in line at some like dance club in Buenos Aires, and the bouncer like pulls them out of the line and takes them in, and like, wait, what did we do wrong? What's going on? He takes them up to like the manager of the club, and somehow the manager thought that they were like famous rappers, just because they couldn't even figure out why. Like they were just dressed like New Yorkers. They had like baseball caps
Yeah.
on and like sports jerseys or something. For some reason, the manager, through whatever kind of biases he had, or stereotypes, he thought they were rappers. And he said, if you want to give us your CD, we'll play it in the club. And they let them in like the VIP area and gave them free vodka, and all these girls are coming up and trying to audition to be in their music videos, and they were just like playing along with it, like, okay, let's just see how far we could take this. And just like these hilarious stories of just being Black travelers in the world. That was just a really interesting, eye-opening episode, I thought, hearing some of that. So that's the first episode in my third season, if people want to check that out. And I actually have, if people visit my website, farfromhomepodcast.org, I think, or my Twitter feed, if anyone still uses Twitter or X or whatever, I actually have a little page there which says like, if you're new to the podcast, you may want to check out these episodes.
Mm.
Another one that comes to mind is this story I did about this guy I met, Adi Somek, who traveled around the world making balloon hats for people. Just a crazy
That was
story.
niche.
It was definitely niche. And it's more than just like a clown twisting balloons at parties. Like he's claimed he could like read people's auras, and like
Oh,
he
wow.
he went with this photographer, and this other guy made this whole documentary about him, and just these amazing photographs of like this family of nomadic people in Mongolia with all these crazy balloon hats, or like the hats match the landscape around them, or like the person, like, have you ever seen people like pictures of people with their dogs and like, oh, they look perfect for each other, like these hats went perfectly with the people. Just so it's kind of visual, it's kind of a little hard to describe in audio, for the radio podcast story, but that was just a fascinating story as well. So yeah, I've done a few interesting things like that over the years. Yeah.
Okay, they sound pretty interesting. Let's put it that way.
Yes.
That rapper story is interesting. I had a fairly similar experience. Obviously, I'm a white guy, so it's not the same. But my friend, I was in Rio, right, in Brazil, and my friend said, "Oh, I met these couple of rappers." I was like, "Oh, yeah." He said, "Oh, they've invited us to this club," and yeah, they got taken. to this like VIP area, and they invite us in, like the bouncers let us in, and we're getting like free drinks. I'm not convinced that these guys are rappers. I think they were same as you. They were perceived as rappers, and they sort of went along with it and got through to this like VIP area in Rio. I'm like, what have we been doing here? But somehow my friend met this guy in the same club, I suppose, and he said, "Oh, get your friends here," and we ended up staying there all night.
Oh wow.
And it started getting a bit crazy when I had to go home in the end. It's just going to be, I did last like 4 a.m., but it's just a crazy experience. I couldn't really grasp what was going on. So the weird thing about that is that was like the first night of my Rio trip, but my close friends were coming the day after. And they said, "Oh, what happened to you last night?" I was like, "I don't even know really where to start with that." I think we met a couple of rappers and people thought they were rappers, and we were in this VIP area in this like club in Rio. I don't really know what happened. Yeah,
that's the great thing about travel. Like you have these crazy experiences that you probably never have back home. I just love that. Yeah.
Where I said a bit vague about why it's a bit weird, I think some exotic dancers were coming in, dances of that nature, and me and my friend said, "Yeah, we should probably go home now." It's starting to get really late. Kind of make a joke about that, and we did get out there. If you go along with it and you say yes to a lot of stuff, and you're pretty open to that sort of stuff, you can get some crazy stories, as you would know from your travels as well.
Yeah, say yes as much as you can. That's one of my lessons. Yeah, these crazy experiences, and sometimes just go with the flow, go along with it, and you never know what'll happen.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great quote. Okay, and where can people find you on the website and social medias?
The website is farfromhomepodcast.org, and if they just search for Far From Home in any of the podcast apps, I think there are a few imposter shows that I need to get after, but if they just look for my logo, it's like a road sign with like a question mark, and like you don't, like you're lost, you don't know where you're going.
Imposter shows, what do you mean by that? As in someone's copying you?
There's a few other shows that have taken my same name, even though I was first, and so I need to get a proper trademark and make sure that I'm the only one who uses that name. It's been on my to-do list for a while. And that's not even to mention the whole Spider-Man thing and Far From Home. I get all these Google alerts now of Spider-Man Far From Home. There was a movie a few years ago. So that's super annoying. I can't do anything about that, unfortunately. but I've been doing this show since 2016, which is like, dinosaur years in the podcast world.
It is.
So I was definitely first. Yes.
I'll get the correct links in the show notes so people can access them. And if you're a podcaster or creative, I think copywriting is key. It's on my list as well.
Yeah, trademarking, yes.
Yeah. Okay, gonna finish the episode with some quick fire travel questions. You might not like some of the questions, so this will be quite interesting.
I'll try my best.
Okay, I'm gonna kick off with, it's travel question time. Tomorrow, if there is no restriction for you and you can travel to 3 countries and go and slow travel is fine, and go and immerse yourself in 3 cultures, where are you going to go?
I want to travel more around Turkey. I mean, I just drove across Turkey on our trip, but it was really bad timing because it was like 6 days after there was an attempted coup. This is in 2016. So we just kind of zoomed across the country. It was really bad timing. So I still haven't been to Istanbul or Ankara.
Wow.
So it's been on my to-do list for the longest time. So I really would like to go to Turkey and spend more time there. I still haven't been to Buenos Aires, so I want to go to Argentina. I've heard great things about that city. So that's been on my list for a while. And the third country, I don't know. Probably return to South Africa. I was only in Cape Town once many years ago, and I loved it. And I'd love to go back and also see more of South Africa. Yeah.
Okay. And you mentioned obviously the Mongol Rally is a big, huge road trip. But if you could road trip one area in the world now, where would you road trip?
I would love to do a road trip across South America. I think that would be
across
or down north to south. I guess.
Okay. Yeah.
I feel like for whatever reason, like I said, Latin America has always interested me, and that's just huge part of the world. I've only been to Peru and Ecuador, and so it's an enormous continent. And I mean, I'd like to become totally fluent in Spanish first, but once I am, I would just love to take a road trip north to south or south to north in South America. I think that would be really cool.
Okay, and if you could have a cup of coffee and sit somewhere for an afternoon and watch the world go by, where are you going to sit?
I I'm not a huge people watcher. I like to be doing things, you know.
Okay.
I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, maybe somewhere in Costa Rica or something, sitting out in some balcony, looking out of the rainforest, hearing the howler monkeys and everything. Maybe I don't know,
That'd be pretty cool.
something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Tell me 3 favorite cuisines you've experienced worldwide.
I mean, as brief as our trip across Turkey was, I think that was the best one meal we had there was probably the best food we had in our entire Mongol Rally trip. In Cappadocia, we ate at some restaurant. I think the food was all cooked by like women in the village or something.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
there was like these really good like rolled grape leaves that are like these thin little like the size of cigars, and these like stuffed like squash blossoms, and it was all vegetarian. It was just delicious. So I love Turkish and like Middle Eastern food. So yeah, that was great. Other cuisines, I don't know, maybe back in Ukraine, which I know people don't think of like food from that part of the world as, you know, that
Ukrainian food.
extraordinary, but I think maybe just culturally having grown up with, you know, my mother's side of the family was Ukrainian, and so eating the what she would call pirahe, like the pierogies and the, you know, the sauerkraut, the kapusta, and all those like traditional foods, the holubchi, like the stuffed cabbage, and you know, all of that. It's just this is somewhere deep in my memory or whatever. It's kind of sentimental to me a little bit, even if the food's nothing that extraordinary. And I guess Thai food, you can't go wrong with Thai food. It, I mean, it's an easy answer, but you know, it's everything is super good, super cheap, really vegetarian friendly, and I'm vegetarian. I'm actually pescatarian, I eat fish.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's definitely, I think one of the, it's interesting. I mean, I feel like people think of the world's great cuisines and they think of like French cooking or so. To me, that's just boring. Like I like lots of spices, lots of
Oh, yeah.
interesting, you know,
Yeah.
I feel like that's way more fascinating. I really big into Asian cuisine. Mexican as well. That's a fourth answer, but yeah.
Mexican's always in there. I think
Yeah.
traditional Indian food, I mean, God,
Indian, yeah.
the options are endless. Like different types, dry food, curries, dosas. There's so many variety in that.
I still actually haven't been to India, and I'm a little overwhelmed by Indian food just because there's so many things that I've never
Yeah.
seen before, so many weird ingredients, so many, you know, it's like I don't even know where to start.
Great vegetarians though.
Oh,
One of the best
yeah.
places in the world. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. But I feel like the Indian food we have access to, like in America, is like just the very tip of the iceberg of what,
Very, yeah.
you know.
I even think it's its own cuisine. I don't know if Indians, what they think about this is common, but I think British Indian food is
Oh, yeah.
almost its
The
own
curries.
cuisine.
Yes.
It is Indian to an extent, but it's nothing like the
British
stuff we get in
curries.
India, right?
Yeah.
So
Right.
when I say Indian, I mean like Indian food in India, which I experience. But not
Yes.
if I say a British Indian curry, I'd say that because I think it's different.
Yeah. Right.
Is there any place where you went where you had low expectation and it turned out to maybe be one of the highlights you've experienced before, like in terms of your travel career, if you like?
I mean, generally, I don't go to places if I feel like I would have low expectations to begin with. I mean, there's some places I go to that I don't really have many expectations of what they're going to be like. I think I did really like Ukraine when I was there, but I think again, I think I'm biased just because that's like my culture, my people going way back. But Kyiv seemed like a really cool city. Like it was like a university town. There was this like young vibe. I met this like college student who like showed me around and took me to some really cool like bars and like play. It just seemed like there was a lot happening there. So that was cool. And Lviv was a beautiful like city, very much more European. The cobblestone streets and the streetcars, and like that was really cool. I'd love to go back there someday. So I think I was very pleasantly surprised with Ukraine. I don't know if the average person would feel that way. And of course, we're talking about all this, you know, aside from the context of war.
Yeah.
But that for me, I was kind of impressed, and I thought it was really fascinating. I thought it's somewhere I would like to return to someday. Yeah.
And was there any place that you didn't like, or you maybe felt you just don't want to go back there?
I think the answer that always comes to mind is Phnom Penh, Cambodia.
Okay. Yeah,
it's I mean, everyone goes to see Angkor Wat and you know all of that, which is really cool and amazing scenery. But the city of Phnom Penh is really, there's not that much to see. It's not so much of a tourist city. I will say the Tool Slang Genocide Museum is amazing. If you do the audio tour there, it's highly worth it.
Got to.
And we didn't have time to go to the killing fields as well, but it's very dark, but it's really good history. It's very well done. But aside from that, the rest of the city of Phnom Penh did not impress me, as everything is very scattered all over the place. There wasn't a lot to see, and I just did not like it at all. I don't really have any desire to ever go back there. Sorry to any Cambodian listeners you might have.
I've got some,
but I just was not a fan. But Angkor Wat was great, and even Batam Bang, my brother and I went
to. Bang, yeah, we went there.
Yeah, not a place many people go to, but we went. We rode on. There's like this bamboo railway.
Bamboo train.
Which is not in its. I hear it's totally different now. Like it's not the original tracks, and but we went on this like bike tour while we were there and got to see some of the local villages and local businesses. And we also took this day trip and went out to this like floating village, and that was super cool. So, but Phnom Penh, not really a fan.
Okay. And to finish the episode, more of a highlight, if you like, can you give some people maybe one or two sentences as to why they should actually travel and maybe get out of their comfort zone and go and try and experience these amazing things that you described today?
I feel like it just broadens your perspectives. It's just, you have such a different view of the world when you, and just a view of how things can work. Like just seeing things from other perspectives and realizing that, not just like, this is how we do things and this is the only way or the best way, in my country where I live, like seeing, well, how do they do that in this other country? And maybe we have something to learn from this other place, or, I feel like we could all learn from each other, and just seeing, especially people like Americans, like they don't, because they're on this big continent that's surrounded by an ocean on each side, like so many people don't have passports, or if they travel, they'll go to Western Europe or somewhere, but, or the Caribbean, but, to really kind of get out there and see other parts of the world, it just gives you a whole different worldview, to understand that, maybe this other place is to be even open to the idea that maybe there's somewhere that's superior to us in some way, that maybe we, we're not just always we're the best way and the only way, but maybe we actually have something to learn. I think that's helpful to kind of be humble and to be open to other ways of thinking.
Yeah, I think people need to be vulnerable and humble. Yeah, I think you're right. To actually accept that there just may be somewhere that's a bit better or does things a bit better than your own place.
And to have personal experience and exposure to, we hear things in the news about these other parts of the world, but have you ever actually met someone from this place? Have you actually walked the streets of this place? Like to see it firsthand and to get your firsthand impressions of a place, it's so different than just from afar. Like, I think it's really valuable to have that perspective.
Yeah, totally agree. That's a great way to finish the interview, actually. So, Scott, thanks for coming on the podcast. Some crazy, eclectic stories you've got there, especially for this podcast as well. And I think your podcast is definitely one that people should definitely check out. And I will be checking in to catch up. I'm really excited I've got your episodes like listed on my playlist to check out. So I'm really excited for you to come on the podcast, share your stories, and get yourself out there on my audience, and hopefully they can benefit from your stories and your wisdom. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it. This was fun.
Cheers. Thank you.
Hey, yeah, just a quick one. I just want to say there are many ways to support this podcast. You can buy me a coffee and help support the podcast with $5, or you can go to my merch store with the affiliate link with TeePublic, where there's plenty of merch available to buy, such as t-shirts, jumpers, hoodies, and also some children's clothing. Thirdly, which is free, you can also rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podchaser, or Good Pods. Also, you can find me on social media on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok. Simply just search for Winging It Travel Podcast, and you'll find me displaying all my social media content for traveling, podcast, and other stuff. Thank you.